Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 67 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Colorado Avalanche, in which the Sharks have lost 4-2. So it was the second half of a back-to-back with travel against the league's best team. So this was going to be a very stacked deck that the Sharks were facing off against, and not too surprising that the Sharks ended up losing. In fact, it's kind of even somewhat impressive that the Sharks didn't lose by an even wider margin here tonight. And a big part of that was the newest San Jose Sharks, Kaapo Kähkönen, definitely doing his part here tonight. Starting off in the first period, the Sharks just were in a different sort of universe than the Colorado Avalanche. The Avalanche were significantly better. Most of the zone time, the Sharks barely got many shots on net. They had essentially zero actual good chances. Pavel Francouz's game in that first period was very, very easy, but because Kaapo Kähkönen was there and he made multiple high danger saves, the game was still ripe for the taking, as it was tied 0-0 after the first period. And in the second period, the Sharks did wake up a bit. The early parts of the second period were Avalanche dominated, as Newhook would score the first goal of this game to make it 1-0 Colorado. But then there was a turning point around the midway part of the second period. The Sharks ended up with a power play, and while the power play didn't necessarily do all that much, it seemed to still turn the momentum somewhat. The Sharks then put the stringed together a good 3-4 shifts in a row before they managed to cap it off with a Timo Meier goal to tie the game, his 31st of the season. And so once again, now after 40 minutes, the game was tied once more. Problem was, though, is the earlier factors that I mentioned. This was the second half of a back-to-back for the Sharks against the best team in the league, who was playing at home. The Sharks had to do some travel there just overnight to get to Colorado. Plus, you take into account that it's Colorado, the altitude, yada, yada, yada. This was going to be a very tough third period to win, and the Avalanche showed why. They were once again the better team in this third period. They'd scored the first goal from Helm to make it 2-1. The Sharks would manage to tie it up on a Brent Burns goal, another game where Brent Burns manages to score, and so it was 2-2, but eventually in those last few minutes, it would be the Avalanche to put themselves up by 1. Rantanen would score on the power play to make it 3-2, and then it just seemed as though the Sharks couldn't really get much of a foothold in this game. Even though they were the team trailing by 1 goal in those last few minutes of the third period, it was the Avalanche who had most of the zone time, and they'd eventually add yet another goal, this one from Burakovsky, to make it 4-2 Colorado and end the game like that. So it was a valiant effort for the San Jose Sharks, but of course you do not get any points in the NHL for valiant efforts, and as such the Sharks will remain with 0 here tonight. On to the players to talk about. We once again have the Sharks' first line, which was once again the Sharks' best line of the night. Not that much of a surprise, considering this would be what Bob Booner would call loading up the top line. It's a top line that has been so good for the Sharks, so it's very difficult to justify separating them. But of course, it does lead the other 3 lines somewhat offensively anemic. The only other really top 6 player you have on the team past that first line would be Logan Couture, who of course in this particular game was working with Matt Nieto, who is like a 4th line forward on a decent team, and Sasha Chmelevski, who is an extremely inexperienced rookie, so not necessarily working with the best of pieces. But back to this first line, it was very fun once again to watch the Hertl, Meier, Barabanov trio work with it. It's, you could say what you will, and I have, about the Tomas Hertl extension back right before the trade deadline. Whether that was a correct move for the franchise is certainly up in the air and can be argued, but it cannot be argued that it is going to be fun to watch, as long as Meier resigns as well. It is going to be fun to watch the Tomas Hertl Timo Meier duo just in general for many years to come in San Jose. These two players have some very solid chemistry together. They're working quite wonderfully together as well. They're both like 30 goal scorers at this point, or at least I believe Hertl is extremely close to a 30 goal scorer at this point, and Barabanov is just complementing them extremely well. I also liked how they've stood up for each other as well. Both Hertl and Meier are certainly able to sort of carry their own, I guess you could say, because they are bigger players, taller, stronger. But Barabanov, not to say he's weak or smaller or anything like that, but in comparison to his two line mates, he is down there. And so late in this third period, he gets at it a bit with Cale Makar, kind of wrestles him to the ground, and then it is when he gets back up, he's essentially staring down three Avalanche players, Makar, Rantanen, and Taves, and then you just see Hertl fly in there. He yanks down Rantanen, he then yanks down Devon Taves. And I just appreciated seeing Hertl stand up for his teammate, let the Avalanche know that they can't push around and intimidate Barabanov, his line mate. So you could definitely see the camaraderie a bit also on this first line. So hopefully, like I said, the Sharks re-sign Meyer, and hopefully they re-sign Barabanov, and this can be a solid producing line for the Sharks well into the future. When it comes to the second line, like I mentioned earlier, Couture not really given much to work with. Nieto was inserted back into the lineup here tonight. Not too much of a surprise because the Sharks are probably looking for a bit of a better penalty kill, which has not been that great over these past few games, though I was extremely surprised to see Nieto not go back onto the third line, and if not, just go straight to the fourth line with VL and Reedy, and instead come up to the second line, because this second line, while it wasn't terrible, I wouldn't say that they were just completely getting dominated or anything, they also didn't really do much of anything offensively, which of course is not a surprise. Chmelevski, like I said, inexperienced. Matt Nieto is not an offensive player, and so you're kind of just letting Couture fend for himself in that particular regard. And you could definitely say of the four top six forwards that the Sharks have, which is Hertl, Meyer, Couture, and then Barabanov, I guess, Couture has absolutely drawn the short straw here, just kind of is being played with a carousel of wingers most of the time, and he just really hasn't been able to establish a ton of chemistry with anyone besides maybe Dahlin, who after that strong start he had to the season hasn't really established himself as a consistent player at the NHL level just yet in his extremely young career. When it comes to the third line, there was a bit of a separation that did occur at the end of last game. Yesterday, I was talking about how I enjoyed watching the Bonino, Leonard, Chmelevski line, and I hope they could stay together at least for a couple of games. That did not end up happening. Instead, Gregor would come to join Bonino and Leonard, while Chmelevski would move up to the second line, and it didn't necessarily work as well. I don't think that this is me saying that, well, if Chmelevski was still on this third line, it clearly would have been fantastic. No, not necessarily. Like I mentioned in the previous game, maybe that line really only looked pretty good because they were against Arizona, and here tonight they were against Colorado, but this line definitely was hemmed in their own zone more often than not and kind of got pushed around a bit. When it came to the fourth line, I was a bit surprised, not to say that Balcers has necessarily been some sort of world beater as of late, but he is still a relatively offensively gifted player, definitely one of the better players currently in the lineup when it comes to actually scoring goals, so kind of burying him on this fourth line with VL and Reedy I thought was a bit of an awkward call. Like I said earlier, I felt as though Nieto should have been in this particular position and Balcers move up to the second line, because eventually when Dahlin does return, which could very well be as soon as Saturday against the Dallas Stars, I would like to see a second line of Balcers, Couture, and Dahlin go at it to maybe give Couture a bit of support there, because like I said, Balcers is one of your better offensive players, and he definitely shouldn't be buried onto a fourth line, which didn't do a ton this game. It wasn't terrible, it wasn't good, it was a classic Sharks fourth line game. When it comes to the defensive pairings, we once again had a rather solid game from Brent Burns. I mentioned this in the yesterday's game, that besides that one terrible sort of no man's land play on the Arizona Coyotes goal, he had a pretty solid game. And here tonight, very, very similar. Brent Burns has just been kind of improving down the stretch here, which is, I guess, nice to see. We'll see if that can manage to last over these last 15 or so games, or 14 now of the season, or actually it is 15 of the season, or whether or not the wheels will once again come off. But it is nice to see that a 37-year-old Brent Burns still has at least a bit in the tank at this point. When it comes to the second defensive pairing featuring both Karlsson and Milosh, I've talked about over these past few games that Karlsson has been struggling as of late, and I'd said, Karlsson just not really doing much. However, or not really doing much on the defensive side of things, I should say. However, there was an article that I saw earlier which actually brought up a very important point, which was that Karlsson, over these past few games, when paired with Milosh, as well as previous to that, paired with Ryan Merkley, has been playing his offside multiple games. He is normally a right-handed defenseman, and yet he is currently playing on the left side, and we saw the issues with that pretty much right there in the spotlight on this Avalanche second goal from Darren Helm. Erik Karlsson on the left side of the ice, and as such he's forced to play the puck with his backhand, and so he just doesn't have as much control with the puck on the backhand. He ends up giving it away to the Avalanche, and that leads to the goal. Obviously, you know, players play their offside sometimes, and they shouldn't, and you hope that they're still not going to be giving pucks away like Karlsson did, but it is pretty easy to say that if Karlsson were actually on his right side making a very similar play on his forehand, he probably wouldn't have given the puck away in that particular situation. So it's obviously kind of a hurdle that Karlsson is currently having to jump over. Right now, the Sharks are icing 4 right-handed defensemen, which are Burns, Karlsson, Merkley, and Milosh. The argument that Bob Booner had given was that both Merkley and Milosh had been playing too well to actually be pushed out of the lineup for a player like Shemek, who is healthy, and so Karlsson just kind of has to deal with it. But having said that, and this brings me to my next point, Ryan Merkley did not have a particularly good game at all. It's kind of weird when it comes to Merkley because he can go 3-4 games in a row where he plays extremely well, is looking like a very strong defenseman, definitely not looking like a rookie through some of those games, making some nice plays at the offensive zone blue line, doing some pretty solid defensive zone plays as well, and then suddenly he'll just have these once in a blue moon type of games once every couple of weeks where he just looks completely lost, and that was another game here tonight. Merkley just not doing enough, was getting beat at the blue line multiple times, the defensive zone blue line. He got walked around by Val Nichushkin at a point for the Avalanche. He wasn't aware enough to cover, I believe it was Burakovsky on the Avalanche's 4th goal, just not really in, his head just was not in the game at that particular point, which is funny because just yesterday I talked about, you know, how impressed I was with Merkley and how his head was in the game when he managed to sweep that puck off the goal line, but maybe because the Sharks were trailing by 1 goal, and so he's kind of trying to think offense first, I guess he gets into that trap a bit, so he's just not really aware and covering Burakovsky's stick well enough. And so while coming into this game, it was a situation where Merkley maybe was playing too good to come out of the lineup. I would not be surprised, though I don't necessarily agree with it either, if Booner would end up benching Ryan Merkley after this pretty pitiful performance, and we'd see Shemek return to the lineup. I guess we will see. Honestly, I'd rather Milosh step out and then something like Burns with Shemek, Karlsson gets joined right back with Megna, and Karlsson can go to the right side, and then Merkley stays with Vlasic, but I suspect we will see number 6 on the sidelines next game. And when it comes to the goaltending, like I mentioned earlier, Kaapo Kähkönen was a big reason why the Sharks managed to keep this game tied for a while. I saw some post-game quotes that Kähkönen was somewhat disappointed with himself. Gave a very similar quote as he did in his first performance with the Sharks against the Edmonton Oilers, where he said, oh, it's not good enough to just be a good goaltender in this league, you have to be a great goaltender. And while I thought those comments were quite fair after the Oilers game, I do think he's kind of selling himself a bit short here after this Avalanche game, because he wasn't really given a lot of support from the Sharks. He essentially had no chance on the Rantanen goal, he had no chance on the Burakovsky goal, he had not much of a chance on the Newhook goal, depending on how you look at this goaltender interference situation. The Sharks challenged for goaltender interference. I thought it could go either way. The refs believed that there was no goaltender interference. Kähkönen believed that there was, so you could say that he had no chance on that particular situation. And so the really only bad goal that you could say would be that Darren Helm goal, which also wasn't necessarily that bad. And then you also have to count the countless other saves that he made in this game that were massive and huge, especially early on in the first period, and so I really thought Kähkönen did have a strong performance tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on the Dallas Stars, and Joe Pavelski will return to San Jose. That should be a pretty exciting game. The Sharks, of course, are out of the playoff race, but the Dallas Stars are mired right in it, and interestingly enough, the Stars are fighting with the Vegas Golden Knights to get into the playoffs, and so, you know, I wouldn't be too upset if the Sharks actually lost, if that meant helping the Stars out for kicking the Golden Knights out of the playoffs. Class dismissed.